Do you remember when a movie failing at the box office actually meant something? When one bad release could end careers, studios, even entire creative eras? The 1980s weren't just about blockbusters and neon dreams. They were also full of ambitious films that arrived at the wrong moment and paid the price. Halfway through this list, things get uncomfortable in a way most people forgot. And by the end, one of these failures might completely change how you remember the decade. Number 15. The Border, 1982. This film failed for one simple reason. It refused to give audiences the version of a star they thought they were buying. At the height of his popularity, the lead actor was known for explosive energy and unforgettable intensity. Viewers expected fireworks. What they got instead was restraint. Silence. A man worn down by routine and moral fatigue. The shift was jarring. The border is slow, grounded, and deliberately uncomfortable. It spends time on small moments, long drives, quiet decisions, characters who don't explain themselves. The story unfolds through atmosphere rather than plot twists, and that confused people who expected something louder. Marketing didn't help. Trailers sold it as a tense thriller. The film itself was closer to a character study. That mismatch turned curiosity into disappointment. Audiences felt misled, and word spread quickly. At the box office, the response was muted. Not a total collapse, but far below expectations for a film carrying that name. Studios quietly moved on. With time, the performance gained respect. The calm delivery, the internal conflict, the refusal to dramatize every emotion. What once felt subdued now feels confident. The Border didn't fail because it lacked strength. It failed because it asked audiences to watch closely instead of react quickly. And in the early 80s, patience wasn't something the box office rewarded. Number 14. The Cotton Club, 1984. On paper, this looked like a sure thing. Stylish setting, big director, classic era glamour. But the Cotton Club walked straight into a trap set by its own marketing. Audiences were sold a fast, exciting crime picture. What they got was something slower, moodier, and more distant. The film wasn't interested in constant action. It cared about atmosphere, about how rooms felt, about music drifting through smoke-filled spaces. It played like a memory, not a thrill ride. The problem was expectation. Viewers waited for momentum that never came. Characters felt more observed than explained. Emotions stayed under the surface. Critics were split. Audiences stayed away. And the box office numbers quietly collapsed under the weight of a massive budget. But look closer now, and the craft is undeniable. The lighting is precise. The music choices feel deliberate. The film understands style as emotion rather than decoration. It isn't loud, it's controlled. And that control confused people at the time. The Cotton Club didn't fail because it lacked quality. It failed because it asked audiences to slow down when everything else in the decade was speeding up. Today, it plays like a time capsule from a filmmaker working against the current instead of writing it. Number 13. Pennies from Heaven, 1981. This is where expectations completely betrayed a movie. Steve Martin was one of the most trusted names in entertainment. People walked in expecting warmth, charm, and easy laughs. What they got instead was a musical that felt intentionally cold. Songs were bright, emotions were not. The contrast unsettled everyone. Pennies from Heaven wasn't designed to make you comfortable. It showed dreams falling apart, characters smiling while failing, music interrupting reality instead of escaping it. For many viewers, it felt wrong, confusing, even cruel in its honesty. The box office reaction was immediate. Audiences rejected it. Critics admired it, but didn't rally behind it. The film quietly disappeared. But years later, it started to make sense. This wasn't a feel-good musical. It was about the danger of believing fantasies too much. Steve Martin gave one of his bravest performances by refusing to protect his image. That choice cost him financially, but it gave the film lasting weight. Pennies from Heaven didn't want applause. It wanted reflection. And in a decade built on confidence, that kind of honesty was never going to be rewarded quickly. Number 12. Ragtime, 1981. Ragtime arrived dressed like prestige and left almost unnoticed. This was a sweeping historical drama filled with recognizable faces and careful detail. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't simple, it demanded attention, and that demand became its biggest weakness. Audiences in the early 80s weren't looking for complex reflections on social change and identity. They wanted energy, momentum, clear heroes. Ragtime offered something denser, slower, more thoughtful. The result was a quiet box office disappointment. But the craftsmanship never disappeared. The performances feel grounded, the direction trusts the material. Scenes unfold naturally rather than pushing for reactions. It feels literary in a decade obsessed with spectacle. Over time, Ragtime earned quiet respect, not as a crowd favorite, but as a serious film that refused to flatten history into entertainment. It didn't fail because it lacked ambition. It failed because ambition without immediacy was hard to sell in that era. Ragtime didn't chase attention, and the 80s punished it for that restraint. Number 11. The Year of Living Dangerously, 1982. This film arrived carrying weight, complexity, and no interest in being easy. The Year of Living Dangerously blended personal drama with political tension. But it never simplified either. Relationships were messy, loyalties shifted, emotions were restrained rather than explosive. For many viewers, it felt distant. The marketing couldn't explain it. Was it a romance, a political story, a character study? The answer was all of them, and that confusion hurt it badly. Audiences didn't know what kind of experience they were walking into, and many chose not to walk in at all. Yet the film's strength is its patience. It allows silence. It trusts the audience to connect dots without being guided. Performances stay controlled. Nothing is exaggerated. That subtlety aged well. What felt cold in 1982 now feels mature. The film wasn't chasing trends, it was documenting uncertainty. And uncertainty rarely sells tickets. The Year of Living Dangerously didn't fail because it was unclear. It failed because it refused to simplify a complicated world for comfort. Number 10. Thief, 1981. This movie didn't fail loudly. It failed quietly, slipping past audiences who didn't know what to do with it. Thief was marketed like a fast crime picture, but what Michael Mann delivered was something colder and more precise. This wasn't about excitement. It was about routine, about systems, about a man who treats his life like a blueprint and slowly realizes that control is an illusion. The main character moves through the world with discipline, silence, and focus. Long scenes unfold without jokes or emotional release. Neon lights glow, but they don't warm anything. The city feels distant, mechanical, almost uncaring. For audiences in the early 80s, this tone felt strange. Where was the rush? Where was the fun? The answer was that Thief wasn't trying to entertain in the usual way. It was building a mood. Man was more interested in how places felt at night than in quick thrills. That patience confused people. The box office response reflected that confusion. Over time, Thief became a foundation. Its style echoed forward into countless crime films. The sound design, the lonely professionalism, the sense that work defines identity. None of that was common at the time. Thief didn't lose because it lacked energy. It lost because it introduced a colder language of cinema before audiences knew how to hear it. Number 9. One from the Heart, 1982. This is what happens when a filmmaker believes in art more than safety. One from the Heart was built entirely on artificial sets, neon skies, painted streets. Everything deliberately unreal. The director wanted emotion to come from design rather than realism. It was bold. It was expensive. And audiences rejected it almost immediately. People expected a romance they could relate to. Instead, they got a dreamlike experiment where characters moved through a world that looked like imagination, made physical. The emotions were sincere, but the environment felt distant. For many viewers, that distance broke the connection. The failure was severe. The budget was enormous. The return was minimal. Careers were shaken. Studios became cautious overnight. This film became a warning sign. But look at it now, and the ambition is impossible to ignore. The colors, the music, the willingness to risk embarrassment for expression. This was a filmmaker choosing vulnerability over comfort. One from the Heart didn't collapse because it was careless. It collapsed because it refused to compromise. It asked audiences to accept emotion without realism, and the early 80s weren't ready for that request. It failed financially, but it proved something important. Total creative freedom comes with a very real cost. Number 8. The King of Comedy. 1982. This movie failed because it told the truth too early. The King of Comedy is uncomfortable by design. It doesn't celebrate ambition. It exposes it. The main character isn't charming or misunderstood. He's persistent, awkward, and deeply convinced of his own greatness without proof. Audiences didn't know how to respond. This wasn't a rise story. It wasn't a redemption story. It was a mirror held too close. Laughter felt uneasy. Silence felt intentional. The film offered no release. At the time, people wanted clear heroes and clear victories. This movie gave them obsession instead. It showed fame not as a reward, but as something chased without self-awareness. That made viewers restless. The box office reflected that discomfort. Years later, the film feels almost prophetic. Its ideas about attention and entitlement feel eerily familiar. But in 1982, it felt wrong. Too harsh, too personal. The King of Comedy didn't fail because it lacked humor. It failed because it made audiences question why they laugh and who they admire. Sometimes the most honest films arrive before society is ready to recognize itself. Number 7. Blade Runner, 1982. This might be the most famous failure on the list. When Blade Runner first arrived, audiences expected excitement. What they got was atmosphere, long pauses, questions without answers. A future that felt tired instead of thrilling. The pacing confused people. The story refused to explain itself clearly. Characters spoke in fragments. The city felt heavy, not adventurous. Viewers walked out unsure of what they had just seen. The box office response was disappointing. Critics were divided. The film felt out of step with the era's idea of science fiction. It wasn't hopeful. It wasn't clean. It was reflective and slow. But time changed everything. As audiences grew more patient, Blade Runner revealed its depth. Its questions about identity, memory, and purpose became its strength. What once felt dull now felt thoughtful. Blade Runner didn't lose because it was empty. It lost because it demanded attention instead of offering comfort. And that demand scared people away. Few films prove more clearly that failure and legacy rarely arrive together. Number 6. Sorcerer, rediscovered in the 80s. Sorcerer didn't fail once, it failed twice. Originally released years earlier, it vanished quickly, dismissed as grim and exhausting. But in the home video era of the 80s, it returned quietly, finding viewers who were finally ready for it. This is a film built on tension rather than relief. Long stretches pass without dialogue. Every movement feels dangerous. The environment feels hostile. There is no humor to soften the experience. Audiences originally rejected that intensity. It felt punishing. But later, viewers recognized its precision. The sound, the pacing, the way fear builds slowly instead of exploding. Sorcerer doesn't rush. It waits, it tightens. And when something finally happens, it feels earned. That discipline was misunderstood at first. The film's second life proved something important. Sometimes failure isn't permanent. Sometimes it's just delayed understanding. Sorcerer didn't change. The audience did. Number 5. The Big Chill. 1983. This one didn't collapse overnight. It underperformed quietly, and that's what makes it interesting. The Big Chill looked approachable on the surface. A group of old friends. Music everyone recognized. Conversations that felt familiar. But beneath that warmth was something audiences weren't fully prepared for. This wasn't nostalgia as comfort, it was nostalgia as confrontation. The film asked uncomfortable questions. What happens when your younger dreams don't survive adulthood? What do friendships look like when ambition fades? These weren't light ideas, and the movie refused to soften them. Audiences showed up expecting something breezy. What they got was reflective, sometimes melancholy, and emotionally honest. The box office response didn't match expectations. It wasn't a disaster, but it wasn't the hit studios hoped for either. Over time, the film found its audience. Viewers aged into it. What once felt heavy began to feel accurate. The conversations landed differently when life experience filled the gaps. The Big Chill didn't fail because it lacked heart. It failed because it spoke to an age group before they were ready to listen. Number 4. Testament, 1983. This film arrived quietly and left quietly. Testament didn't rely on spectacle. It focused on ordinary people facing extraordinary loss. The tone was restrained. The emotions were contained. There were no big moments designed to shock, just a slow, painful unraveling of normal life. That subtlety became its downfall. Released during a time when louder stories dominated attention, Testament felt almost invisible. Audiences didn't reject it loudly. They simply didn't show up. Yet the film's power lies in its restraint. It trusts silence. It lets grief settle rather than explode. The central performance carries the entire story without theatrics. That honesty made it difficult to market. Over the years, Testament earned quiet respect. It became known as one of the most emotionally grounded films of its era. But box office numbers never reflected that impact. This wasn't a failure of quality, it was a failure of timing. Testament whispered when the world was listening for noise. Number 3. 8 Men Out, 1988. Sports films usually promise triumph. This one refused. 8 Men Out told a story rooted in history, ethics, and consequence. There were no easy heroes, no simple victories, just a group of people caught between loyalty and survival. Audiences didn't know what to do with that. The film was thoughtful, detailed, and deliberately paced. It treated its subject seriously without turning it into inspiration. That seriousness worked against it. Despite strong performances and praise from critics, the box office response was disappointing. Viewers expecting a rousing sports story found something closer to a moral study. Over time, the film gained recognition as one of the most honest sports dramas ever made. Its refusal to simplify is now seen as its greatest strength. 8 Men Out didn't lose because it lacked drama. It lost because it replaced fantasy with reality. And reality doesn't always sell tickets. Number 2. Tender Mercies, 1983. This film won major awards and still struggled to find an audience. Tender Mercies is quiet by design. There are no dramatic twists, no sudden turns. Just a man rebuilding his life one small choice at a time. The story unfolds patiently, trusting the audience to notice subtle change. That patience confused distributors. Marketing barely existed. The release was minimal. Despite critical acclaim, the film never gained momentum at the box office. The performance at its center is controlled and deeply human. Nothing is overstated. Emotions stay close to the surface but never spill over. That restraint felt old-fashioned in a decade obsessed with spectacle. Years later, Tender Mercies stands as a reminder that greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits quietly, hoping someone is paying attention. This wasn't a failure of storytelling, it was a failure of support. And it remains one of the most overlooked successes of the decade. Number 1. Heaven's Gate, 1980. This is the failure that didn't just miss expectations, it rewrote the rules. Heaven's Gate arrived at a moment when Hollywood still believed bold ambition was worth the risk. The director had just delivered a massive success. Studios trusted vision, budgets expanded, creative freedom was real. Then this film opened, and everything changed. Audiences weren't prepared for what they saw. This wasn't fast or reassuring. Scenes unfolded slowly. Conversations lingered. The film moved at its own pace, refusing to hurry for anyone. Viewers expecting clarity and momentum instead found patience and atmosphere. Confusion turned into frustration almost immediately. Critics responded harshly. Headlines formed a narrative that stuck. The movie was labeled indulgent, uncontrolled, excessive. The box office collapse was swift. Within weeks, Heaven's Gate became a warning story instead of a film. Studios reacted with fear. Budgets tightened, oversight increased, freedom vanished. One release shifted an entire industry's mindset. But time changed the conversation. Restored versions revealed intention beneath the scale, careful framing, natural light. Performances built on quiet observation rather than spectacle. What once felt bloated began to feel deliberate. The emotional weight became clearer, the craftsmanship harder to deny. Heaven's Gate didn't fail because it lacked vision. It failed because it asked audiences to slow down during a decade obsessed with speed. Its legacy isn't about loss, it's about what happens when art arrives out of sync with its moment. Sometimes the film waits. Sometimes the era never catches up. These movies weren't forgotten because they were bad. They were forgotten because they didn't fit the moment they arrived in. And that's the real tragedy of the 80s. So many bold ideas showed up too early, too quiet, or too honest. If one of these surprised you, drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who loves rediscovering lost films. And ask yourself this: how many masterpieces are still waiting for a second chance?